Hello, we're back and we're covering deontology by way of Immanuel Kant. Okay, so Immanuel Kant is an Enlightenment thinker. So he was born in 1724 and died in 1804. And he is an Enlightenment thinker. So he's working in what's called the Age of Reason. Okay, and so one thing that's important there is that we're also using rational thought to understand our way of working through ethical practice. But don't mistake Kant for a rationalist, but see him as a deontologist, okay? So when we refer to deontology, we're referring to Kant's ethical theory, okay? And so deontology is a way, it's another word for study of duty, but it's also an ethical practice of duty. And so when we're understanding duty there, we need to see duty as an unconditional aim toward goodness, because like with natural law and virtue ethics, Kant also shares the common thread of the aim toward goodness, an unconditional aim toward goodness, okay? So this is really important to understand that our ethical theories that we study are not arbitrary. They are aimed toward goodness, like we pointed out before. Likewise, utilitarianism is also aimed toward goodness. Natural law, also virtue theory, deontology, feminist ethics, etc., okay? And so when we're thinking of deontology, we're thinking of it as duty-based, and the duty is a universal duty that we have toward the aim of goodness unconditionally, okay? So goodness for goodness sake, okay? And so when we're understanding duty, we're understanding that as a goodwill, and we're seeing ourselves acting in terms of rational agents toward the responsibility we have for goodness. Okay, so we've mentioned that with natural law. Deontology shares that. So the easiest way into deontology is by way of Kant's two categorical imperatives. So categorical imperative basically is an imperative that one should observe upon all occasions. So the first thing that we need to understand about that is it has objectivity to it, okay? Just like natural law does, just like even utilitarianism. So there's an objectivity here that is understood by way of universal ethical practice, okay? So in other words, we understand that it is unconditional. To understand that it is unconditional is another way of rationally proposing that this is universal, okay? So that's a really good way of thinking about it. So let's look at the two categorical imperatives. The first version of Kant's categorical imperative is act only on that maxim that you can will as a universal law, okay? So let's repeat it. Act only on that maxim that you can will to be a universal law is the first categorical imperative. And so what's critical to understand there is that this is a way that you could work through how it is that you are practicing and being in the world, how it is that you are being with yourself and others, in terms of as you act, you have a question in your mind, what is this the right thing that I should do that can be measured as a universal law? In other words, act on the principle that you could will the action that you're about to take to be a universal law, okay? So in other words, can the action that I'm about to take be a universal law that everyone should do, okay? So that word should there keys us into its normative component, right? That we should or ought to strive toward goodness. So the way that we know what goodness is for Kant is by asking ourselves about the categorical imperative. In other words, if we ask ourselves as we're about to act, can I act on that maxim that I can will it to be a universal law? If the answer is yes to that, then it's good. See? So in other words, then we are aiming toward the goodness that we seek to achieve that's unconditional as a means of practicing our duty. Okay? And so this is non-consequentialist. In other words, we're acting on principle that we are striving toward goodness as a universal law, okay? Regardless of the consequences, okay? Regardless of the consequences. We will always act for Kant on the duty that we are aimed toward goodness, and the way that we understand goodness is by way of the categorical imperative, okay? Then the second version of the categorical imperative is also interesting. So the second version of the categorical imperative is always treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time an end, okay? So that has several parts to it. The first one is understanding ourselves ethically. So understanding ourselves ethically means that we don't treat ourselves as a means toward an end. In other words, we don't sacrifice our own integrity as a means for an end or someone else's end. So in other words, if we feel that we're being taken advantage of, then we should stand up for that as a way of understanding our universal goodness to be autonomous agents that are respect-worthy, okay? So that's key there. That in other words, this idea that we are treating others never simply as a means, but always at the same time an end. The end there is of particular importance because what Kant is proposing is what he calls in his moral writings, kingdom of ends. That in other words, we should be respecting others as a kingdom of ends unto themselves. In other words, we don't use other people as a means to an end universally. We don't do that universally. And so people are respect-worthy as ends unto themselves. So in other words, we don't let ourselves be used as others' ends, and likewise we don't treat others as a means to an end either, okay? So that's critical, and we do this universally by way of duty and striving toward goodness, okay? So what's key there to understand for Kant is the rational aspect that this is all-inclusive, okay? So in other words, he is objective, so this is the counter to relativism. So in other words, we have it as our duty to always act universally in this way by way of deontology. And the way that we're understanding that is rationally, okay, by way of our own freedom. So that's where we also have the other aspect of Kant that our text doesn't really cover as much of, and this goes a little bit hand in hand with this discussion that we've been having as far as the is-ought distinction. So Kant also has a little bit of a part to play in that too, in the sense that he sees the difference between our rational mathematical understanding of objectivity in contrast to our freedom. So in other words, our ethical lives also are tied with our free autonomous self, okay? So that's really important too, but we understand both of those things rationally. So in other words, we understand the way that we work through our freedom rationally, but yet we also understand that freedom cannot be contained entirely by deterministic way of thinking, by a deterministic understanding. So therein we have a similar line of thinking that we had with Hume, except that Kant is not an empiricist. He's what's called a transcendental idealist. But that's a whole nother lecture. I'm not going to get into that. But understand that there is a distinction with Kant between determinism and prescriptive thinking. In other words, we are also thinking of human freedom when we're considering our ethical lives as well, okay? So I think that that's a good place to stop. Oh, and the other point I want to make right at the end here is with the second categorical imperative, do not under any circumstances confuse it with the golden rule. So the golden rule is the idea that we should treat others as we would have them treat, as we would treat ourselves. So treat others as you would do yourself, something like that. Understand that this is not the same thing, because the way Kant saw it is that if we treat others as we treat ourselves, that's too subjective. It's not universal enough, because there's not a universal way to judge how it is that we would treat ourselves. So there's a difference between the golden rule and Kant's second version of the categorical imperative, okay? So don't make that mistake. But I think that's a good place to end. And thank you so much, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.